Hey guys, welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers. Let me make sure everybody can come in. I am your host, Natalie B. I'm a master beekeeper with Texas A&M, and I'm working with a giant of beekeeping, Les Crowder. Together we have over 60 years of beekeeping experience, and we promote natural and sustainable beekeeping. And we're here to answer all your questions and share our techniques and our philosophy when it comes to beekeeping. I do not know if Les will join us tonight, so I might have to tap dance and just kind of answer all your questions that they come in. The theme might be maybe making sure that we are paying attention to our colonies and get in tune with their natural cycles of weather and forage so that we can better understand the nature of the superorganism. And I'd like to encourage you to ask your questions in the comments, and if you're in Zoom and if you're in on YouTube Live, if you want to ask us your questions there in the comments, and we'll get them answered as well as we can, with or without the help of Les. But as always, it's nice to have him on. So it's nice to see some familiar faces: Brad, Dennis, Patrick, everybody, Monty. I'm not seeing necessarily all your faces, but I recognize your names. So thank you for joining us tonight. And to start, while you're thinking about your questions and you're thinking about what's going on in your apiaries, I will start with what's going on in our apiaries and what we're looking at in Central Texas and how that matters. So we are in a dearth. There's not a whole lot of nectar coming in through our hives. And that also looks like we don't have a lot of pollen sometimes. But when we start going into our colonies, we're looking, actually, the established colonies have food, they have honey and nectar, and some of them even have so much pollen that they're pollen bound. So it really depends on the microclimate of each yard and the structure and efficiency of each colony. So it can't really say we know exactly what's going on. We do notice that it's not a spring nectar flow or a nectar flow of any kind yet. And we're eagerly waiting for the fall nectar flow. In Texas, we have two flows, one in the spring, which this year was quite explosive. And then usually we have a nice little fall nectar flow that helps us prepare our colonies for the winter. So we count on that. Although this year it's been not raining and the dearth has been prolonged. It started early and it's lasting longer than we want it to be. But it doesn't mean that our colonies are necessarily suffering. So the established colonies are naturally going to go through actually all colonies, when there's no resources coming in or very little, are going to go through contraction and brood breaks. And so that's something that's very important for them. It's part of the evolutionary process that allows them to give the queen a rest, to give all the nurse bees a rest, and to give the colony basically a rest, as they cannot find necessarily all the resources they were before that. But meanwhile, they're not exhausting themselves, fetching, pollen and nectar all the time. And that gives them a little bit of a break. So the only concern that Les and I have at this time of the year is the less established colonies, the ones that are in their first year, that we want to keep an eye on. And even then, we don't necessarily go in and feed them. It's only as a case-by-case basis if they need it. So what do we look for our beekeeping practices to decide if we're going to feed them emergency feeding or not? So we're looking for the amount of capped honey they have in store. We're looking for the amount of nectar that we see in the cells. And we look, but to a lesser extent, for bee bread, see if they've got some pollen stored up or not. That one's a little tricky because they tend to maybe necessarily not need it if they're not laying brood, and they can also bring it in as fast as they're consuming it. So not seeing it necessarily in the combs is not necessarily an indicator that there's no pollen coming into the hives. It might be just that they're eating it as they're bringing it in, and that's okay. So on those smaller colonies, the less established ones, the splits from this year, the swarms from this year, you might not have enough resources stored up from the initial flow, or maybe they were made up at the end of a nectar flow and they didn't have time to build up as much as they could have. And those we kind of keep on the watch lists. We just kind of go in, evaluate the resources, and if we feel like they're not getting enough resources for them to get by, then we tend to provide some emergency feeding. And it's never going to be pollen supplements. It's always going to be some sugar syrup of some kind. And we do that only if really we need to, because like Les says all the time, emergency emergency feeding that's done on a regular basis is no longer an emergency. That's kind of mismanagement. You didn't really put your colonies in a situation where they could store enough food and grow fast enough. So that kind of makes me track back to what it is that we do with our colonies, where sometimes the more established colonies are not even sitting on enough food for us to feel comfortable if they've gone through a spring flow and they should have collected enough resources. Well, what happens is that very often we don't really realize how much they need to sit on to continue functioning. And we, if we are looking for honey and we tend to harvest maybe a little bit too much, we then are in a position where we have to feed them replacement supplements of some kind. And so that's something I want to encourage you guys to keep in mind, is to not over harvest your even established colonies, and to really watch the smaller ones so that they have a chance to make it. Now, if you have an established colony that is not looking like it has enough food and you didn't over harvest it, there's a couple of things that can be happening. You might have such an extended drought and dearth that they are going through their stores and running out. And it happens especially with the ones that are not going on brood breaks, that keep brooding up and that have so many mouths to feed. So that's why we usually encourage not feeding pollen supplements that encourage that expansion, because then you have a whole bunch of mouths to feed and that goes through your resources a little bit faster. So keep that in mind. That's a trade-off that you're applying. The other thing to keep in mind is that those larger populations in colonies that are not allowed to take a brood break can go from, if they had a brood break, 12 times the expansion of the varroa population throughout the entire year. And if you do keep them broody and don't give them the opportunity to go on a brood break, that skyrockets to 800 times the mite numbers in your colony. So that brood break is really a cleansing cycle that you want to keep in mind and utilize to your own advantage, allowing the bees to take a rest, decrease the amount of resources they're consuming, contracting, and also decrease the population of varroa mites that they have to deal with. So those are the considerations that we're looking at. In addition, you're just kind of able to better understand the nature of the superorganism if you let them follow closely those cycles of nectar flow and dearth, of expansion and contraction, and just being able to see what the bees do and how they solve those problems, because they're the best problem solvers that I know. And they deal with so many parameters and have so many tools in their bag to address exogenous factors, meaning the factors outside of the hives, the amount of pollen, the amount of forage, the weather, all those factors that are outside of their control, and the endogenous factors, the ones that are in the colony that deal more with like the population and the amount of food that they were able to store, the genetic diversity of their queen. That's going to inform what kind of tools they have in their bag, what kind of flexibility they have as a colony to adapt quickly and efficiently to the variations that they are exposed to. So keep all that in mind and just realize that There's a lot of advice out there that's mostly from, I mean, there's a lot of it that's adapted to and generated by commercial beekeeping operations. And that's great and that works for them, but they're only like 1% or 2% of the general beekeeping population, not the colonies, but the beekeepers themselves. And 95% of us are actually more backyard, small scale beekeepers that don't have the same constraints. We're not transporting our hives. We're not packing hundreds of colonies in a small yard, competing for forage. And we don't have to have that portability of the emergencies. I mean, this is not emergency at this point, the supplements that they're provided in order to boost them. We don't even have that need to boost the populations. There's a difference between a need and a want. And I think as backyard beekeepers, we need to recognize that, because it informs a lot of the decisions that we make, especially if we're trying to be as non-interventionist as we can, so that we can better allow our colonies to follow their natural cycles and better be able to observe them following those cycles of forage and weather. So I do see, I've got a question, Christine, Central Texas here, first year colony is late May. When should the next full hive check be? Should we wait for cooler weather? That's a great question. So in Central Texas, the temperatures still commonly, routinely reach the hundreds in the afternoon, especially. And I don't know when's the last time you went and inspected your hive fully, but usually what I can tell you is that as a general rule of thumbs, we don't get into a full inspection more than once or twice a year, maybe in the spring to make sure that everybody's queen right, maybe everything is in order, see how much old comb there is to cycle out, kind of do some reorganization, potentially when the weather is warm enough. And then we do the same thing, helping them prepare for the winter in the fall. And even then, we tend to not do a really full inspection if we don't have to. So what's the difference between a full inspection and a routine inspection? A full inspection is you're going to go through every single one of the comb, evaluate all the resources, the health of the colony, the population, the brood, the food, everything that you see. You're going to kind of go through the entire colony, and it's highly invasive and highly disruptive, and it doesn't need to be taking place if you otherwise can pick up on the signs of good population, signs of a queen right status, which could be seeing the queen, obviously, is going to make it easy. Seeing brood, especially fresh brood and eggs, is going to confirm that you have a queen that's laying. But sometimes we forget in Central Texas, especially, or during extended periods of dearth in the heat, that our colonies are following the cycles of weather and forage and contracting drastically and even stopping to lay eggs. They can be broodless for quite some time before they resume that. So even then, we only go in and assume they're going to be queen right for the most part, based on the population and what we are looking at, and just kind of close them back really fast. So that's not something we do every more than every 3-4 weeks, sometimes even longer if that's our own bees, if we don't have any obligations. The only time we'll do that a little bit more often is, especially for the full inspections, is when we're doing something specific. That includes splitting, that includes converting, that includes just requeening and things like that. So whenever we really have a specific need, we might go through the hives a little bit more often. But yes, to your point, if you're looking for a full inspection, waiting for cooler weather is definitely what I would do. You want to make sure that the bees are not stressed, that you're not exposing the colony to robbing by being in there so long and pulling out basically all the internal organs. The combs are kind of like their ribs and their bones, and you just kind of don't take it apart as much. It's never a good thing, but it's even less of a good thing when it's this hot and there's this little food coming in, because then you have all the other colonies in the 1 mile radius and more that are going to smell that insides of that hive exposed, and that are going to be interested in potentially coming to steal food. They have nothing else to do. They're sitting there. There's not that much forage for them to find, and that's really going to attract them. So you want to wait. The other aspect of that is that why do we want to go through a full inspection, and especially in the summer in the middle of a dearth? This rarely a good reason to do that. So yes, I would encourage you to wait until later in the season and cooler weather, and I would make it worth it, meaning don't necessarily go through a full inspection right at the beginning of the fall nectar flow. Just kind of look for signs of the queen and that everything's right, but wait and take that opportunity to do that later as you're preparing and making sure that they have enough food and resources for them to overwinter. So maybe wait a little bit in the middle of that nectar flow. And at that point, if you don't see enough food, you really need to start thinking about what your plan will be. If you're going to combine that colony, if your choice is to feed them, feed so that they can make it through the winter, or share and equalize some food from other colonies, that's what I would kind of keep in mind there. So I don't think that Les is going to join us today, and I don't even have a text from him. So I'm going to keep tap dancing, and I appreciate you guys asking me questions so I can keep going with my answers. It's good to see you guys. Richard as well. I see that Doug is here, Sean is here, Sarita and Larry. That's awesome. You guys are really cool. And let us know what's going on in your hives and how we can help. Okay, so Sean is asking, he fed a couple of first-year hives with sugar water. So first year hives is important. One hive, the weakest, has small ants around the jar and going into the hive. What do you think? I hate ants. I know you don't like ants. Nobody really likes ants. Hey, James, it's good to see you. Hey, Bruce. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it on YouTube. If you have questions or any kind of comments, write them down, and then we'll see if we can help out with that as well. Okay, so ants. I don't like, I don't mind ants. Usually they're not an issue, but when you have smaller colonies, maybe there's a concern that they might be stealing some food. Usually we see ants at the top of more established colonies, kind of nesting there. And they might be getting some food, but all in all, I find that having some ants under the lids on top of the hives, there might be something that's symbiotic with the colonies, where you've got maybe some formic acid, or they're keeping other pests at bay or something. But usually there's kind of a really balanced little harmony there that I don't mind at all. The only problem is for when I go in and I have to shoo them away and they get through my suit and my clothes and they bite me. That I don't like. But on the smaller colony, I mean, if they're really inside and looking at the sugar syrup jar, this is where I would say just kind of use your judgment to see if that's becoming a problem for the colony. If the bees are not taking that sugar syrup, maybe there's an issue. Maybe make it a little bit thicker first for them to not have that syrup ferment. And when the syrup ferments, the bees don't necessarily want to take it. Then it sits in the hive, and then you might attract ants. So feeding has got some drawbacks, and this is one of them, where you have potentially you're attracting ants into the colony, or worst case scenario, you're attracting robbers. So if you want to keep the ants from getting into your hive, I would provide mechanical barriers, such as ant moats, and or maybe potentially some of that paste, that organic paste that's called stick. It's a stick. I forget what the name is. It's a sticky foot, tanglefoot. Tanglefoot is what it is. And then you can just kind of make sure that where the ants are crawling up, there's a barrier there for them to not be able to go up. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would kind of play it by ear and see if they're really a problem for the colony, or if it's just a perception that those ants are an issue. If they're on the jar, maybe if that colony has enough food, you maybe remove the jar for a while. That might be also one way to deal with it. Okay, so Richard, So can letting the bees do bee things and not trick them to brood up be considered my IPM, my integrated pest management? This is a loaded question. I hope so, because apparently if I don't do an IPM, all my bees and bees within 100 miles of me are going to die. I hear sarcasm there, Richard. I hear a lot of pressure from the Facebook, scientists and experts that Brad was talking about during our apprenticeship. So yes, there's a lot of talk. It goes the same with the treatments. If you don't treat your bees, they will die. If you don't feed your bees, they will die. The truth is, the bees don't need us to feed them. They're not cows. They're not dependent on us to or chickens. They're not dependent on us to come and feed them if they're locked into a hive. They're not locked into that hive, and they go and find food outside. And even when there's no food outside, they should have some resources, stores that they're sitting on that they can go through and use for their purposes. If you do push them, if you do trick them to brood up, you're exposing yourself to all kinds of issues. You're increasing the population outside of the expansion period, and that means more mouths to feed, and they're more exposed to changes in the environment when that's the case. They have to really care for that brood. The increase in pests, yes, that's part of the IPM. If you don't encourage them to brood up, you're not going to have that huge expansion in mite population that you would otherwise have if you kept them broody by design, if you push them to have brood. And so I kind of look at it this way. If you're planting grass seeds and then you're putting fertilizer for the grass to grow, and then you have weeds, so you're putting fungicides on there, and now you've got to cut all that grass and you have to water it, all that so that you can start that cycle. Isn't that a lot of work? Isn't that a lot of expenses when you don't necessarily need to do it? Of course, the grass doesn't need food, but the point is that those bees, they can find and sit on their own food and just do well. I find that in a period of winter dearth, that can also have really dramatic consequences that are not intended. For example, I've talked about this before, you can have that premature swarming going on where you have all those bees and all of a sudden there's that congestion happening in the hive, and your mated queen leaves with a bunch of the bees and leaves you behind a colony with a fresh virgin queen that's going to need to get mated, and there's no drones out there, right? And some of that to a certain extent can happen in the summer as well, where you can feed a colony so much that first, it's going to be dependent on your food. If you stop that feeding, that's going to be catastrophically damaging to them. And second, you might push them to congestion and swarming at a time where there's very few drones out there. And you're going to end up being left with a queen that might not find enough drones to mate properly. Yes, Brad. You're muted, so you're going to have to unmute yourself.
I did it. Lines up on Facebook, they talk about all this feeding. The problem is they're trying to anticipate when dearth is going to end, so they're going to try to build up their population. But look how long our dearth has ended or lasted this whole summer. And so they have these massive populations, and they're why bees are starving to death. And we're having to feed them. Look at them swarm all these pollen feeders. Well, yeah, because you overfed your bees. Now there's all these bees to feed, and there's no food. And so that's why I said it fall in line. But just if you watch all those things, it's amazing the thought process of it's just a cycle. They're just defeating themselves.
It's a vicious cycle, exactly. And to Richard's point, you're not allowing them to have that brood break. That's a very valid integrated pest management strategy that the bees themselves use with a lot of success. So yeah, the bees within 100 miles of you are not going to die if you don't have your colonies, if your colonies are brooding up necessarily. Although I would kind of agree if I stretch it a little bit, because if you brood up your colonies so much, you increase the population of mites, which might be an issue for colonies that are not, that are going to be exposed to that increasing population. Okay, so yeah, and to Brad's point, you might be, getting started. You might be in the starting blocks way too early and exhaust your engines before you get to the next nectar flow. Okay, what is IPM? Integrated Pest Management. It's a scientific method of minimizing the pressure of the pests and pathogens as non-intrusively and as efficiently as possible without necessarily having to resort to harsh interventions, harsh chemicals, meaning there's a kind of a pyramid. Think of it as a food pyramid. And at the top, so at the bottom, you would have cultural education. First of all, education. You need to understand what's the biology of the honeybees themselves, but also the biology of the entire colony and those cycles of expansion and contraction I was talking about. Why do the bees do what they do, and what does it look like throughout the year? But also the life cycle and the biology of each of the pests and pathogens that are the most damaging to your colonies or the most likely to cause problems in your apiaries, in particular varroa mites, small hive beetles, and things like that. So that's the educational aspect of that integrated pest management. The next scientific step above is going to be cultural. What kind of queens are you keeping? Are they well mated? Are they well fed? Are they good quality queens? And are the genetics adapted to your local conditions of weather and forage? Those exogenous outside conditions that really matter. And the research shows that basically the queens that are local and from swarm cells and from survivor stock are bigger and do better than the queens that are imported, that are bred from grafts. All that stuff matters, right? So just keep stacking the deck in your favor is what the integrated pest management pyramid is. And then you have cultural could be where you're putting your colonies. If there's too many of them in one area, you're going to have too much pressure, too much competition. And that means your colonies are going to be stressed. And so that's something else I would do before feeding, is looking at where my bees are and what's the competition, that carrying capacity that we talk a lot about. The other aspect of that cultural level is, are those bees fit really? And by feeding them, are we really wanting to propagate those colonies that are not necessarily fit to survive in the area without our help, right? There's a fitness that we need to keep in mind. And the next level is going to be mechanical interventions, making sure you have good equipment in good standing. You've got a clean comb. Natural comb is going to be a better option because it's more adapted to their needs. They can build cell sizes of all kinds. They can communicate better because the vibrations are more efficient on natural comb than on something stiff like plastic. The fact that they can build smaller cells instead of larger cells like 5.4 that are artificially too big for them, those will tend to increase the problems with the mites. Whereas when the cells are smaller, they tend to be more, the reproduction of the mite is kind of stopped in a way, or not as big. So all that is going to come into play. There's all kinds of other things that you can do, including mechanical traps and all that stuff. But this is a whole lesson on integrated pest management, and we can talk about it for hours. Richard, thanks for bringing it up. This is what we're going to talk about in more details in our apprenticeship on Saturday, by the way, Brad. Okay, so Doug is asking, oh, actually, I got more questions. Ray's asking, should I add and subtract bars and move follower boards depending on spring flow, honey harvest, dearth, fall goldenrod, etc.? So yes, you can. We find that follower board is more work than we're wanting to do. We find that the bees don't need it, and in some cases it gets in the way of the bees, and they feel congested if we don't get there fast enough, right? When there's no follower boards, they are free to build as many combs as they want till the end of the hive, right? If you have a follower board after your nest and all of a sudden they hit some nectar flow, they're going to want to expand, and they're going to end up backfilling and having some congestion in the brood's nest, and that's going to push them to swarm. So there's something to keep in mind But if you are wanting to do that work, and if you wanted to keep up with it on a regular basis, because it becomes almost like a weekly or bi-weekly thing that you need to go and take a look at in spring flows, whenever there's a flow, then yeah, I mean, you can do that. I just, try it without the follower board and see how that works for you, because it's a lot less work and it's a lot less danger of them swarming on you. And when it comes to making sure they're in the smallest possible cavity as they can handle in a horizontal configuration, I find it doesn't really matter as much, because the brood's nest is all under those bars and it's really tight in that area towards the front of the hive. Even if you have some empty combs in the back or empty space in the back of the hive, that doesn't seem to impact them as much as in a vertical configuration where you have a bird's nest and you have empty space all around them. That becomes the thermodynamics of that are a lot harder for them to manage when you have too much space. So hopefully that answers your question. And Brad says he uses a follower board and he moves it according to bee coverage of frames. No bees on frames, he removes it, the frame, I'm guessing. So yeah, you can do that, or you can just, I mean, we're notorious for leaving some combs that are dry and empty in expectation of the nectar flow coming back in. And if it's not laden with resources, like especially bee bread, we find that the bees are fine and there's not really a lot of pests going in there, right? Unless they're really dark combs, and then we'll remove them, which we need to cycle them out anyway. So with that, Doug's asking, Ray's asking another question. No, hang on. I'm going through the questions. Doug, how likely is it we don't have a second flow this year? So you're speaking to my biggest fear right now. With the droughts and the weather and the temperatures that are above 100 regularly and no rain in sight, it's really starting to get a little dicey out there if we don't get a nectar flow in the fall. So we typically do, and it might not be as long as usual, but I'm hoping we really do. The bees are still finding some food. We do see some colonies are pollen bound, which is interesting considering a lot of beekeepers are saying you should feed your bees or they will die. And I'm like, oh, I have too much pollen in my hives. I don't know what what we're looking at. But yes, it's a fear. So kind of keep that in mind. Don't over harvest. Watch the stores, and it's a guessing game at this point. Estimate if they're going to be able to first get to the nectar flow in the fall, and just kind of figure out a backup plan if they don't end up with a nectar flow in the fall. But at that point, you can still go and feed if you want to, keeping in mind that every time you feed, you're not letting the population thin out the less fit colonies. And that's a choice that you can make if you don't want to lose those colonies. But very often it creates more problems, and you might end up not having that good luck in the following year if you've been feeding them to just get there. So just keep that in mind. It's nothing wrong with, at some point, if you don't have a really viable colony, to try and combine it and just split back in the spring, right? So just really rely on your strongest, more established colonies to maintain your apiary. And it's important to have at least a few of those if you have weaker colonies, to kind of help out, boost the smaller ones, and just equalize and do things like that. And go from year to year. That's what Brad does with the forward freeze frame. So you have, okay, that's more of a lay-and-see issue. Well, I mean, anything that's horizontal can work with a follower board, Brad. So lay-ins or top bars or horizontal lengths, you can do that if you want. Like I said, it's too much work for us. We don't think it brings us enough advantage, and it actually gives us more work. So with that in mind, do you guys have other questions, or should I keep that dancing and talking about our philosophy on beekeeping and what's going on these days? There's a lot of experts online and social media that are giving a lot of advice that I would just kind of recommend you take with a grain of salt and assess what's your strategy, what's your philosophy with the bees, how much do you want to be close to your colonies and understand their nature and how they expand and contract, and trust them for the most part to do what they do best, instead of imposing our own will and fears on them. So just kind of keep all that in mind, and remember that every colony is different, every microclimate is different. So you should always base your reactions on your apiaries, your interventions, on what you're seeing and what your colonies are telling you. So let me see if I've got more questions. No. Anybody has a specific questions, seeing something that they're looking at in their apiaries right now that might be of interest that we could talk about tonight, in addition to resources and how we address potential dearths and expansion and contraction. Let me think about other things that we've been talking about. Also, this is just a personal complaint. I understand there's some people out there that are like, well, you really shouldn't listen to the master beekeepers. You should really just go and do your thing and don't listen to them. But those people are kind of also at the same time presenting themselves as self-proclaimed experts. And my big thing is that you're a better beekeeper when you've got both experience in the hives and education about the biology of the bees. And so I'm going to remind everybody, I've got the better of both worlds. I just got distracted because I got two hands raised up. So Brad, you had your hand up. If you still want to ask a question, come back in. Richard, you have a question right now. So if you want to unmute yourself, and we'll get that question first.
Do you recommend the master beekeeping program?
I do. I think that for several reasons. It kind of motivates you to learn more about the theory, and the books that they have on their lists are excellent books that we don't necessarily take the time to read if we don't kind of set ourselves up to take that exams, right? That there's that pressure, there's that peer pressure as well. That's going to kind of get you to read those books that are very important. My favorite one is The Biology of the Honeybee, because it's written from not a beekeeper's perspective, imposing their own strategies and managements and practices, but from the perspective of the biology of the colony. And it's very detailed in all the mechanisms, from swarming to expansion and contraction to mating to all kinds of things that are really important for all beekeepers to know. So even if you don't go through the actual exam of the Master Beekeeper program, going through the motions of studying the materials is really going to make you a better beekeeper than just trying to kind of figure out on your own what are the bees doing, right? Basically, you could have all the experience in the world and learn so much from the program and those study materials that you wouldn't be able to figure out on your own, even with the most experience, and vice versa. If you're doing only the study of the materials, only the theory, and you don't have any of the hands-on experience and the time in the hives, the frame times, which is, by the way, why I recommend beekeeping pods. If you're fairly recent in beekeeping, work with other beekeepers in your area so that you don't have just your hives that you're going through, but also their hives on a rotation, so that you have more time opening the hives and going through them without stressing them as much, right? If you have only 2 hives, how often are you going to get in there? How often are you going to do a full inspection? And how are you going to be able to learn as much and get all that hands-on experience than if you are going through 50 hives very quickly? If you have 10 people in your group, right, you can, and each of them has 5 hives. Now you're getting through 50 hives every 3 weeks, or you can do it on a rotation. And that's going to help you learn and try to go and get more colonies if you can. That's also going to help out. And just see if you've got experienced beekeepers in the area that are willing to let you shadow or learn and be their swampers, basically. That's what I did when I first got started. I begged my local experienced, beekeeping operation to let me help them out. And I was already, you don't want to be like brand new beginners. You want to have some knowledge under your belt, which is kind of, catch 22, because otherwise you're going to be in their way rather than helping them out. So it's not free learning. It's important to remember that these people are super busy, and they're not there to teach you for free. So have something to bring to the table if you want to get their mentorship, is basically what it is. Be ready to work and work hard. And that's okay, because you're going to learn so much more than if you were just going through your own bees. Keep in mind that they might be a sideliner, or they might be a commercial beekeeper, and then as such their goals and needs are different. Their constraints are different from that of a backyard beekeeper, if that's what your goal is. So it's a great learning, but just keep in mind what your philosophy and your processes are going to be at the same time. Yes, Brad, you're muted, I think.
Okay.
Am
I back now?
Yeah.
Two things. One, to finish up what you were saying is that I've talked to a lot of people about getting mentors when they're getting started, but I told them also, make sure you get a mentor that agrees with the ideas you want to do. In other words, you don't want to be in complete contradiction of the person that's mentoring you, because then you feel like you're beating your head against the wall. And so, but anyway, I just wanted to add that to what you said. The other thing is anybody familiar with hogwort, Hogwart, weeds?
Oh, I thought you were talking about Harry Potter.
So does the internet.
Right, exactly. I have to look it up. I might be, but it's not ringing a bell right now. Sometimes I'm more visual than I am sometimes. Yeah.
Well, I've had snow on the prairie, and then I was like, oh, well, here's this stuff that's starting to bloom, and I took a picture, and it was hogwarts, and that's Worts. Okay. Anyway, they said it's slightly poisonous to bees and stuff. So now I have a concern, because someone grew up, because we didn't mow last year because of the droughts and stuff. We haven't mowed, and we were letting our snow on the prairie come back up. And now I'm concerned with that being mixed in with it. And so are the bees going to go after that, or will they skip that and go straight to the snow on the prairie?
So my belief is that if they have anything else available, they'll go to that first. They're no dummies. They know if it's, going to have an impact or not on them. They're not going to go voluntarily forage first on the toxic stuff, and then it's going to get diluted unless that's the only food source available in the area for that time period. So I can't answer that question without knowing what the cycles of forage are doing in your specific area, but that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I was just worried about that weed, since I heard it was toxic. There's a little bit bothersome, toxic to bees and to people.
In the grand scheme of things, if it's truly wildflower and they've got plenty of other sources of food, chances are it's going to be a drop in the bucket anyway, and it's not going to do much of anything. Okay. Right. So,
all right, thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Okay, so Patrick's asking, how much drinking water should we provide for a typical beehive? So this question is especially important for us in Central Texas, because it gets so hot and we have that drought and that dearth going on. So as much as they can take. As much as they need is what I would say. So basically offer a source of water that's not going to dry out ever, and make sure there's rocks and floaties and whatever in it. And you can keep improving it by bringing in some water from a river or a pond, and kind of seed it with the goodies that make it alive, that water's alive. And you can add water plants, water lilies, reeds, a papyrus, all things like that. And you can add, if it's big enough, little mosquito fish, so that they eat the larvae of the mosquitoes and don't turn into a swamp that's going to cause you problems. And the bees don't care, but I do if I have an infestation of mosquitoes. And just make sure it never dries out. They go through a lot of water. It's actually more important for them often than having all that constant nectar flow. It's very important in the spring. It's very important for them making the bee milk, the jellies for both the workers, the queens, and the drones, which, by the way, I don't know if you know that, but all three of them have different compositions and different goals. So feeding, the reason I say that is because I keep harping on the grafted queens, where you pick out worker larvae and start turning them into queens. Well, the first few hours of their lives, and a significant portion of the time their larvae is actually, in the grand scheme of things, they're fed worker jelly, which is not as rich and not as nutritious and has not the same composition. So your queens that are made from natural swarm cells or even supersedure cells are going to be always better quality than your grafted queens. So keep that in mind, right? So it's a lot of times, especially breeders are pushing for, and commercial beekeepers are using the requeening process very casually. And it's a non-casual event. It doesn't always go as planned. You don't always get a better queen. And very often you get an inferior queen if it's grafted than what you would have gotten if you had let in your queen, your original natural swarm cell queen, or a queen that they made themselves. So just keep that in mind. But I digress. So you need that water for the worker jelly. You also need that for them to cool their hives through the swarm cooling effects, where they spray some water throughout the hive on the cells and then create an air current so that they can exchange it's thermodynamics, basically the exchange of heat and pulls out that heat out of the hive. So water is super, super important. It cannot dry out, and especially if you have a hot area, and especially if you have a dearth. Some people I know actually provide their colonies water in the hive in a feeder. But I think that if you have a really good source of water not too far out, that's good enough. So just as much as they can, as much as they want is what they answer to that. Yeah, you're welcome. Christine, how can you gauge how much honey reserves a small colony will use during a dearth? Oh, this is a loaded question. It depends. That's my favorite answer to everything beekeeping. It depends. So basically the honey, it depends on the population. It depends on the energetic needs of that colony. So if you have more mouths to feed, they'll go through more. If they have more fluctuations in temperature, if it's hot or if it's cold, they're going to go through more honey. So there's dearths both in the winter and in the summer. The winter dearth is no forage and cold temperature. They cannot go out and feed themselves. And then in the summer, you don't have a whole lot of food available. And that is also a dearth. So how much do you gauge? Small colony. So if it's a non-established, meaning a first year colony, a split, a swarm that's not established quite yet, it's more sensitive to, it's more fragile. It's balanced, it's homeostasis, it's equilibrium. It's going to be more fragile, kind of like an aquarium that's just established. Initially, you get a lot of variations until it balances itself out. And so in colony, that would be the second year. If they make it through the winter dearth, typically they will balance themselves out in their second and even more so in their third year as they're more established and larger. But a small one, I would say, at least have a frame or two of nectar and maybe a frame or two of honey, even for the small ones. If they don't have that, consider I would say at least a minimum one of each, one measure of honey capped and one measure of nectar, or at least some wet cells. If they have honey, they can always make their own supply of energy, but they're going to need that water to dilute the honey, by the way. That's the other thing they need water for, so that they can use it for food. And so it's really the pantry, the backup food. They don't really want to use that. It's just preserves, right? What they really want is the nectar. So if you have dry as bones combs and there's no nectar coming in, that's when I start wondering if I, want to be very careful with feed and provide emergency feeding or not. And so that's my minimum is one honey, one frame. After that, you're kind of going in a dangerous path. They've got no safety net, right? So if you cannot come back within a couple, 3 weeks, and there's still no food coming in, or they're not, they could be living hand to mouth, meaning as long as there's enough food for them to sustain, they're not starving, but they're not growing either, right? So it kind of depends what you're looking for, how well established those colonies are, and so on and so forth. Hopefully that answers your question. Brad, I was told water sources needed to be within 100 yards of the hive. So need is great. We want them to be, yes. So want and need, yes. So we do what we can with those colonies, right? Having any water nearby within, the closer, I cannot even say that. It's not the closer, the better, because if it's within 30 feet or so of the colonies, especially in the path of flight, they're probably not going to take that water. So we like to put our water further out than 30 feet and usually more like to the sides or on the diagonals of the entrance of the hives if we can. We will entice them to come and get it more with, inoculating it with pond water, all the plants, all the stuff, maybe some table salt. And if they haven't found it yet, maybe a drop of lemongrass oil to entice them. But yeah, outside of that 30 feet perimeter, I would say the closer the better, because the less energy they're going to have to expend to go fetch it and bring it back to the hive. So 100 yards, sure, that's a good number. It's not always easy to do it that way. So the closer the better after the 30 feet is what I'm saying. But if it's on the same property and it's a little further out, just know they're going to expend a little bit more energy to go fetch that water. And it's a trade-off in the end, right? It just kind of depends what's happening out there. It's always a trade-off when it comes to bees, to colonies. Doug, can multiply hives just one smaller water source like a bird bath with rocks, or will they fight? Oh, multiple hives use, yes, they can. Usually that's good, but the problem with that is that you have to keep refilling it, and it's kind of hard to do, especially when it's hot and dry out there. They can go through this depending on the number of colonies in the area, not necessarily just yours, and the population, the size of your colonies and their water needs, and the rest of the wildlife that might be using it, like wasps and other, animals. You might end up going through water faster than you can replenish it, or you have to stand guard all day to keep track of it. So I would say, personally, the larger you can put your water source basin, the better it's going to be. You're going to have more of a balance. You're going to have more of a just kind of a healthy ecosystem that you build for the bees, and that they can rely on too. It gets really stressful on them if they've been relying on a water source and it keeps drying out on them. They're going to end up looking for something further out than what you have in your yard. So in the end, that's not necessarily going to be really helpful if they dry out. Richard says, I have a water automatically spray a compost pile for an hour each day. The bees seem to like it. Let's talk about that. So there's a lot of nutrients in that compost pile. And I'm not surprised at all that they like it. It's got minerals. It's got probably fungal mycelium. And the bees use that mycelium very often for medicinal properties. To increase the fitness of their colony. So I'm not really surprised at all that they would love that compost. It's great. Just make sure that compost is not too close to your hives, because what happens then is you might be offering a breeding ground for your small hive beetles, right? They love that soft, rich dirt. They can go pupate more easily into that than they could in the rocky, dry, sandy, inhospitable environment closer to your hive. So just make sure that the small hive beetles larvae can't get to that pile of wet compost. Otherwise, that's a great idea. I love that. Yeah. So we have 5 more minutes, guys. Speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least until next week at least. But let me know if you have other questions. I got one that just popped up. Oh, pool salt under the hives. Oh yeah. So while you wonder what you can do to decrease the amount of small hive beetles in your apiaries or your various colonies, first of all, in Central Texas in hot weather areas, we recommend now putting all your hives in the shade if you can. It's just way too hot out there, and the heat is a huge energy drain on the colonies as they try to cool it and spend a lot of bee hours working on that. They have to get more water, they have to fan more air. It's just more stressful for them to keep that temperature. Especially, that's another aspect of being broodless. If you have a brood nest in your colony year long, not only are you exhausting your queen, you're exhausting your bees, but you also have a very strict requirement on the range of temperatures that a brood nest needs to stay at. That really puts an additional demand and energy suck on your colonies, right? You're gonna have to, it's like, when I don't have babies, I don't have to have the air conditioning in the hive, right? But when I have babies, I really need to be careful. Those are delicate. So I'm going to work super hard to keep that bird's nest within that temperature range. So that's another reason why it's okay and actually recommended to let them take a brood break when there's a dearth. That's why they do it, right? That's one of the reasons they do it. So Sarita and Larry are saying we have 3 small colonies that wear packages. So this year, I'm assuming, we've been feeding them a quart of 1-to-1 sugar syrup once a week because they're not established. They came in with nothing. Their combs have been dry, which is why we choose to feed. That's a fair, intervention, and it's up to you at that point. It's always up to you to keep your bees however you want to. So it's just so that I can give you all the advice in the world. In the end, the decision is yours. But yeah, I think that's fair. Their combs have been dry, which is our established colonies is faring well so far. The 3 smaller colonies seem hangry, meaning hungry and defensive, every week when we feed. Guess they're too hot. Well, they might also be getting picked on by the larger colonies that are not looking for food. And if you're feeding, I would recommend feeding actually all of them, because you have babies in your apiary. If you feed just the babies, but you don't feed the large colonies, they're going to smell it and they're going to circle in like sharks, right? And they're going to go and pick on those smaller colonies that might not necessarily have the defenses that they need. And it's really going to make them hangry, or for all you know, maybe they're getting their food stolen. It's okay if you want to share some of the resources from the larger colonies and equalize a little bit. Just make sure that when you transfer over honey and nectar and potentially even bee bread, that you're not bringing in the bees that are on those bars or frames, because those are most likely to be foragers, especially on the honey and nectar. Well, maybe not the nectar, but it's just kind of like you have older bees that might be more able to fly and go back to their hive and say, hey, our food went that way, we need to go and fetch it back. There's a target. Their defenses are, it's like inserting a spy inside of that colony, right? So just make sure that when you transfer food, you're not transferring the bees with it. You can also choose, if they have enough resources, to transfer a little bit of brood with the accompanying nurse bees these times, because they're going to be able to take care of those babies, especially if they're not capped. Or some capped brood, and you can leave the bees on there as well to boost their numbers and make them stronger. So as much as you can, without taxing too much those larger colonies, once in a while you can boost them. But if you feel that they're really not getting enough, it's okay to increase that amount of food. What I recommend is 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 sugar syrup. The goal is not to get them to build comb or necessarily, just give them energetic resources, right? And also it doesn't ferment as fast. It's a little bit harder to digest, and so there's a trade-off there. There's always a trade-off. But if you want 1 quart a week, you might want to increase it to 1 quart every 5 days, or 2 quarts every week maximum. I wouldn't go any further than that. The danger to feeding too much sugar syrup is that, especially the colonies that don't have larger populations, you might end up having them backfilling the brood's nest with that liquid, leaving the queen no space to lay, which means that population is going to get even smaller. I've seen many beekeepers feeding heavily and losing their colonies because they cannot replenish their population, right? So just be mindful of that. But I think that you can go up to 1 to 2 quarts a week without too much damage. Just kind of see what they're doing. If they're not taking it in, then cut back a little bit. But yeah, that's okay. I mean, for the baby bees, the baby colonies, the non-established ones that we got through artificial means like packages and small splits and things that were not ready, then I think it's okay. We caused this situation. It's not a matter of a lack of fitness on their part. It's something we created artificially. And personally, I'm totally in support of feeding those colonies and helping them out. Hopefully that answers your question. And I think that's it. If anybody has any more questions, if you want to ask it now, and we're good. I'm getting thumbs up, smiles, and everybody seems pretty happy. Hopefully that was helpful. And with that in mind, I'm going to take a look at YouTube. There are no questions. If you want to join us again next week on Monday, 7:30, this is what we are here for, helping you out and maybe providing you food for thoughts. To Brad's point earlier, that's what I will conclude with. When you find somebody helping you or you're learning from somebody else, there's a lot of advice out there that's not necessarily good, or they might not agree with you. And that's okay too, by the way. Just know what your perspective and your goals and needs are, and just kind of listen to what's going on. You might not agree with everything they say, but you might still learn something, right? So it's something to keep in mind. It might trigger some thought patterns and some changes, minor things, especially if they're more experienced. I think that there's value there. I'm not saying listen to people, treat your bees or feed your bees all the time, not necessarily, but it's up to you in the end. So it's okay. It's okay. I go and listen to it. It makes my hair stand straight up on my head sometimes, but I find it makes me think about why I'm doing things the way I'm doing, if anything else. So with that, thank you so much. And hopefully next week we'll have Les. He should be back. Thank you, Monty. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. And have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon. Brad, and I will see you at the apprenticeship on Saturday. See you guys later. Bye.
Thanks, Natalie. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.